It's clear capitalism doesn't work very well at the moment, but most of us feel there isn't anything to be done. We're stuck with it because there's just no alternative. That's nonsense. There are plenty of good, workable suggestions for reform, and here are 4 of them. We have to bear in mind that capitalism isn't just one thing. There are almost as many varieties of capitalism as there are capitalist countries. There are American, German, Singaporean, Swedish, Danish, Korean versions of the thing. The differences include the size of the welfare state, from around 10% of GDP in Korea to over 30% in Finland. The importance of state-owned enterprises, producing less than 1% of GDP in the US, but 22% of GDP in Singapore, and the power of trade unions, with nearly 70% of workers unionized in Norway and only about 10% in the US. Capitalism has got dials, and we can adjust them. Think that Sweden, that supposedly high-tax addicted country, only introduced income tax in 1932, 2 decades after the US, and nearly a century after Britain. Or remember that the US, that pro-rich place today, had a top income tax rate of 91% between 1950 and 1963, and it didn't do them much harm at all. So we don't have to chuck capitalism in the bin. The trick is to tweak and reform it in intelligent ways. When people hear of options to adjust capitalism for the benefit of all, they tend to think, that sounds beautiful, but in the end, the freest variety that you find in the US will ultimately outcompete the others because it's just superior. The argument goes like this: the US variety maximizes growth by minimizing the constraints on wealth creation, which creates higher inequality, but in the end makes everyone better off in absolute terms than under a more equal but less dynamic system. But if you look at facts, it's overwhelmingly not true that the freer varieties of capitalism grow faster. From 1955 to 1980, the time when regulations were much stricter, the world economy grew 2.6% per year. For the next 30 years, the heyday of neoliberal economics, it grew at only 1.3%. In its miracle growth periods between 1958 and 1982, Japan, Korea and Taiwan had governments hell-bent on dictating business activities, and it worked rather well for them. Contrary to the popular belief that a large welfare state is bad for economic growth, Finland, with a welfare state 1.5 times bigger than that of the US, 30% of GDP as against a 20, has grown faster than the US, with an average annual per capita income growth rate of 2.7% for the last 40 years, against 2% in the US. A well-designed welfare state with integral retraining and redeployment programs promotes rather than deters growth. Importantly, when people feel secure, they take risks, which is the lifeblood of capitalism. Secure people dare, as the old slogan of the Swedish Social Democratic Party used to go. Unlike what some economists like to tell us, it doesn't have to be a hard choice between security and stagnation on the one hand, and perilous insecurity and economic dynamism on the other. It isn't some inevitable natural phenomenon. You sometimes hear that CEOs need to have huge pay packets or they won't deliver the goods, but data consistently shows no relationship between the rise in executive pay and executive performance. Then there's the claim that redistributing wealth impoverishes everyone, but some of the most productive and wealthy countries in the world redistribute avidly. Before redistribution through the tax system, Germany in 2011 was a far more unequal country than the US. Germany's Gini coefficient, an indicator of income inequality, in which 0 means absolute equality and 1 means absolute inequality, was at 0.51 higher than in the US, where it was 0.5. But after redistributive taxes, Germany's Gini coefficient fell to 0.29, while the US, with a far more elite-friendly tax system, saw its Gini coefficient fall to only 0.38. The rise of the financial industry is a blight on capitalism, making it unstable, unequal and very short-termist. For example, in the 1960s, if an investor bought a share in a company in the UK, they held on to it for an average of 5 years. By the mid-2000s, the number had fallen to a mere 7 months. Faced with a radically diminished patience of their investors, companies have done a host of nasty things to make investors happy right now, at the expense of the long term. They suppress wages, squeeze suppliers, and chuck back profit at shareholders rather than reinvesting. Between 1950 and 1970, the 100 largest US corporations retained 65% of their profits every year. But by the 2000s, they were retaining a mere 6%, vastly diminishing their own abilities to invest for a properly successful future. It's actually rather easy to encourage long-term oriented investment. You just need to give greater voting rights and tax advantages to long-term shareholders. And you need to have sovereign wealth funds and national pension funds, representatives of the long-term collective interest, using their considerable financial power to back long-term oriented corporate behavior. Above all, mergers and acquisitions need to be made more difficult, as it's the threat of these that typically pushes managers towards actions that please fickle short-term investors. All these schemes may seem like pipe dreams, but they're far more tantalizing than this. They're real possibilities alive in certain favored, enlightened corners of the globe right now. There's no need to give up on capitalism. We just need to understand it a little better and stand up to arguments that bully us into accepting its worst versions.